The embers glow. The forest was still. Only the low rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a nightbird broke the silence. A pale orange sun hung low in the sky, casting long, copper-colored shadows over the land as twilight approached. Somewhere between the last stretch of trees and the ancient stone ruins that jutted from the earth like forgotten teeth, a boy moved quietly. Kale padded over moss and leaf litter with the careful steps of someone used to being ignored, and hoping to stay that way. His boots were worn through at the toes. His coat, once brown, had faded to a nondescript gray. In one hand, he clutched a sling, though it hung limp at his side. In the other, he carried a satchel filled with mushrooms, roots, and whatever else he could find before the sun dipped completely beneath the trees. He paused at the edge of a shallow clearing, eyes scanning the ancient ruins before him. They were older than his village, older than Aloria itself, people said. The stones were cracked, some toppled, others standing tall in defiance of time, covered in lichen and strangled by creeping vines. Birds never flew overhead here. Animals gave it a wide berth. But Kale had never felt afraid of it. He took a step forward. The moment his foot crossed into the circle of stones, the air shifted. It was subtle, barely more than a tickle down his spine, but Kale felt it. As though the ruin itself had awakened. He pressed on. In the center of the clearing stood a slab of stone, waist-high and smooth like it had been cut yesterday. It pulsed faintly with warmth as Kale approached, though the light was so dim he wasn't sure if he imagined it. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the cool stone. A spark flared. He staggered back, blinking. The slab now shimmered faintly, not with a flame, but with something deeper, an ember. A heartbeat of fire inside the stone. Kale felt it before he saw it. Drawn forward, he leaned closer, squinting into the faint light. There, nestled in a shallow depression at the center of the stone, was a small fragment of glowing crystal, no larger than a child's thumb, yet burning with a fire that didn't consume. It hovered slightly above the stone, spinning lazily. Kale hesitated, then reached out. The moment his fingers touched the ember, pain lanced through his body. Not the sharp pain of a wound, but something deeper, like every cell in his blood had caught fire. He tried to pull back, but his hand wouldn't move. The ember flared, rising into the air between his palm and the altar. A voice, not quite heard, more felt, whispered inside his mind. Flamebearer. The light burst outward. Kale cried out, clutching his head. Visions, images that weren't his, flashed behind his eyes. Cities burning in golden fire, a tower crumbling beneath a red moon, a face cloaked in shadow watching from afar. Then darkness. Kale lay motionless for a long while, face pressed into the cool moss. The smell of damp earth grounded him, anchoring him back to the world of the living. When he finally stirred, the pain was gone. The ember was gone too. But the mark remained. He pushed himself up onto shaky elbows, his breath shallow and fast. The sun had dipped below the treetops, and shadows now pressed in around the ruins. A warmth pulsed from his left forearm. When he pulled back the threadbare sleeve of his coat, he saw it, a glowing mark, etched like a burn into his skin. It resembled the ember, but more intricate, like a flame cradled within a circle of ancient script. Kale stared at it, heart pounding. What in the gods' names did I do? The stone altar no longer glowed. Whatever magic had dwelled there was spent. The ember had chosen him. But why? A rustle in the trees snapped Kale out of his thoughts. He scrambled to his feet, hiding his arm under his coat. The sound wasn't the wind this time. It was footsteps, heavy ones. He ducked behind one of the toppled stones and held his breath. A moment later, two figures entered the clearing. One was tall and wrapped in a long cloak, the other shorter, stockier, wearing armor. Neither looked like they belonged in a forest this deep. Kale had seen travelers and traders before, but these two moved with purpose, like they were searching for something. They were here, the tall one said. The voice was low, cold. The seal is broken, Flameborn, the armored one asked. Not yet, but touched. The tall one turned slightly, and Kale caught a glimpse of silver hair and eyes that shimmered unnaturally. We must find them before the ember settles. Kale didn't know what that meant, but he knew one thing. They were talking about him. And they were dangerous. He waited until their backs were turned, then slipped away through the trees, moving like a ghost, his heart slamming in his chest. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest. By then, the sky was a blanket of stars, and the wind carried the faint scent of smoke. Smoke. Kale crested the last hill and stared down at his village. Fires burned in several homes. People were shouting. Shapes moved in the streets, shapes that didn't belong. Men in dark cloaks, swords drawn, were going door to door. Kale stumbled back into the trees. They were here already. He had led them to Ashmere. Dash dash dash. He didn't sleep that night. Huddled in a hollow tree a mile from the village, Kale wrapped his arms around his knees, shivering despite the spring air. He could still see the glow on his arm through his coat. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. What had he awakened? What was the ember? Why him? Memories came in waves. The pain, the voice, the visions, that face behind the flame. Flamebearer. It sounded like a title. A curse. Or both. By dawn, he knew he couldn't go back. Even if the village wasn't completely burned, he'd never be welcomed now. They were already wary of him. The strange boy with no family, no history, found in the woods during a storm and taken in by old Marta, the herbalist. Old Marta, was she safe? He didn't dare return to find out. Kale stood, brushing leaves from his coat. He had only a small knife, a few roots and mushrooms, and the sling. But something in him had changed. The ember hadn't just marked him. It had entered him. He could feel it now, like a second pulse. He turned toward the mountains in the east, where the stars had lingered longest, and the air seemed to whisper. Somewhere out there were answers. And he needed them before the people in cloaks found him again. Kale traveled east, keeping to the game trails and avoiding roads. The cloak of the forest wrapped around him like a second skin. He moved with the instinct of a boy raised in the wilds, silent where others would stumble. But even his practiced steps couldn't hide the ache that grew in his legs and the burn in his stomach from too little food. On the third day, he found a creek and followed it, hoping it would lead to a larger river, or civilization. Instead, it led him to someone else. He heard the whisper of movement first, a step too careful to be a deer. Kale froze, crouching low among the reeds. He had no weapons but the knife, and even that was better for cutting roots than fighting men. His heart pounded. He could run, but the stream at his back would slow him. So he waited. A woman emerged from the trees, cloaked in green and gray. Her hair was black, braided tightly. She moved like a shadow, but Kale saw her eyes the moment she spotted him. They widened, surprised, not hostile. Didn't expect to see anyone out here, she said softly. Least of all a boy hiding like a hunted fox. Kale didn't reply. He stayed crouched, muscles tense. She raised her hand slowly. Not here to harm you. What do you want? His voice came out hoarse from disuse. Answers, she said. Same as you, I'd wager. Kale narrowed his eyes. Do you work for them? The ones in cloaks. She didn't flinch. If I did, you'd already be bound and bleeding. She took a step forward. What's your name? Kale hesitated. Kale. Lyra, she said, and gave a small nod. You're carrying something. I can feel it. Kale backed away. You don't know anything about me. She smiled, but it wasn't unkind. I know the signs. I've seen one like you before, years ago. The mark. The fire. You found the ember. He froze. How do you know that? Because, she said, pulling back her sleeve, I once carried one, too. There, on her arm, was a faded scar, a mark shaped like a circle of flame, almost identical to Kale's, though long extinguished. What happened to it? I gave it up, she said quietly. Or it gave me up. Doesn't matter now. What matters is that someone, or something, put that ember back into the world. And now it's inside you. Kale said nothing. A part of him wanted to run. But another part needed to stay. You need help, she said. I know people who can give you answers. Why would you help me? He asked. Lyra's eyes darkened. Because if you don't learn to control it, the ember will destroy you. And everything around you. Dash dash dash. They traveled together from that day on. Lyra was patient, but not soft. She made him train with the knife, showed him how to walk silently, how to build fire without flame. She spoke little of her past, but Kale saw in her eyes the weight of old choices. The ember inside him began to stir more often. Once, when he tripped and scraped his arm, the blood hissed as it hit the ground. Another time, when a snake lunged at them from the underbrush, Kale raised his hand without thinking, and the creature burst into harmless flame before it reached him. Lyra saw it happen, but said nothing for hours. Finally, one night as they camped beneath an overhang of stone, she spoke. The ember chose you for a reason. Maybe it's fate, maybe it's a mistake, but it's in you now. And if the cloaks are hunting you, then you need to be ready. For what? For what comes next? Kale didn't sleep well that night. Visions danced behind his eyelids, visions of the tower, the red moon, and the flame that whispered secrets in a language he didn't understand. But one word burned brighter than all the rest.